Hi, I'm Nico Valenzuela. I'm a landscape and architectural photographer. I'm a photography content writer and creator. This is Starkey, and welcome to my YouTube channel. So don't forget to click like, subscribe, and hit the bell button so that you can get notifications for when I release new videos about gear reviews, about new stuff, about tutorials, and basically anything about photography. So one of the most common questions I get about photography, if not the most common question overall, is what camera to get. And I get this question not just from photography enthusiasts, but also actually more commonly from people who just want to start taking photos. And it's not as simple a question to answer. And there are a lot of factors to consider, but okay, let's answer it one by one with different scenarios. Now, most commonly, what if you just want to take photos every day of your food, of the things you do, and just document your life entirely for memories or social media? What's the best camera for you? Well, there's a saying that goes around the photography community that any camera in your hand is the best camera, and that's true. And for most of us, we all have at least one or two cameras in the form of our smartphones. And if you fall into that category and you just want to take photos of everyday life, you're not really going to sell your photos and you just want to keep memories going, then your smartphone is the best camera for you. Why? Simply because it's with you everywhere you go. Now, my wife hates me for this, but I'm basically stuck with my phone. My phone is always in my hand, just like now. But it's the reason why I never miss a moment that I want to take a photo of. And for most people, that's actually very beneficial. Your phone is with you everywhere, and depending on what phone you have, it's actually very capable. Okay, so some phones only have very simple cameras. You have one camera with automatic mode. Now, other phones like this one, it's a Samsung, it has a manual mode which basically emulates things that other cameras can do. So some cameras have more advanced functions wherein you can control certain aspects of the photo or of the settings, just like more advanced cameras. Now, for this phone, for example, you can control ISO, which is basically the sensitivity of the sensor to light, meaning that when your ISO is higher, you get brighter photos. And it can also control shutter speed, which is basically the amount of time that the shutter or the sensor is recording light, which means that when your shutter speed is slower, you get more light into your photo. The downside about smartphones is that almost all of them cannot control aperture, which is the opening of the lens to let the light in. This also controls depth of field, which is basically the fraction of the field which is in focus for the photograph. So there, you have ISO, you have shutter speed, but no aperture control on your smartphone. So here's a quick run through of the things you need to know about the aspects that you control in your camera. ISO is the sensor's sensitivity to light, which means that a higher number in ISO means a relatively brighter photo. If you compare the photo on the left, there are more shadows, and the photo on the right, which was shot in a higher ISO of 1200, the photo is much brighter. Now, another thing to consider is that higher ISO gives birth to things we call digital noise. Digital noise can potentially ruin an image in terms of image quality and sharpness. These things can be quite distracting for your photo and can turn out to be some artifacts when you print your photographs. Shutter speed, which is measured in seconds, is the amount of time that your sensor is exposed to light. This is the time that the shutter is open, which lets the light in. If you look at the photo on the left, there are a bit of light trails. It is relatively darker because it was shot for less amount of time. If you look at the photo on the right, it is brighter with more light trails because it was shot for 5 seconds. Shutter speed is also one of the key determinants to sharpness and clarity. If there is something moving in your photo, it can be blurred if your shutter speed is too slow. If you look at the photo on the left, it was shot with 1/100 of a second, and the moving object or the moving person is very sharp and clear, as compared to the other photo wherein the moving car was blurred because it was shot for 2 seconds. Aperture is the opening of the lens that lets the light into the sensor, which means that the bigger opening gives you more light and relatively a brighter image. It's important to note, however, that a bigger aperture is represented by a smaller number. Now, another factor that is controlled by aperture is what we call depth of field. This refers to the fraction of the frame that is in focus. If you look at the left, you can see a photo that was shot at f8, which also shows a bit more detail in the background. If you compare it to the photo on the right, it was shot with f2.8, which shows that the background is blurred and there is a lot of separation from the background to the subject. Now, if you're someone who likes to go traveling or you want to take more advanced photos, even of your everyday life, or you take photos of, for example, products, food, or anything else, but you don't really need something big and you don't really need to change lenses, then compact cameras can be good for you. This is a Sony RX100. This is the 7th generation, but basically most cameras like these are very capable. For this one, you can control ISO, you can control shutter speed, and you can also control aperture. The only difference that this one has from the bigger cameras is that it has a fixed lens, though it can zoom. So actually this can go from wide angle to telephoto with a lens of 24mm to 200. And that is actually very flexible for a camera this small. So there, if you need something that can fit in your pocket but take lots of photos and take lots of photos from different lengths, then this is a good camera for you. It's a compact camera, it has a 1-inch sensor, and the battery lasts for a lot longer as compared to if you're taking photos with your phone continuously. So there, this also has Wi-Fi, a vari-angle screen, and a whole lot more. Now, of course, if you want to take more serious photos, meaning that you need bigger photos, bigger sizes, better resolution, of course, you're going to have to go to the bigger cameras. This is a Sony a7R III. This is my main camera and my favorite camera. And it has 42 megapixels. Now, 42, that's actually quite a lot, but Sony has an even bigger sensor with the a7R IV, the next generation of this, which is 62 megapixels. Imagine that. That's good enough for billboards and basically anything that you would need to print big. Now, of course, this also caters to creating online content, which is actually very small. That's just 2000 pixels, which means that you have a good variety and a good range of being able to create different sizes of photos in very good quality. Now, as I said, the difference between this one, aside from the size of the sensor and the images that they produce, is of course that the lenses can be changed. Now you can change your lenses. This is a telephoto lens. It's a 70-200 with an aperture of f4, and it also has image stabilization. So that means it's good for when you're taking photos with very, very fast movement. Even if you're trying to catch the movement, it will compensate for the movement and avoid shaking and blurring of your photos. Now, of course, we can change the lenses to maybe a wide angle for when you're taking landscape photos, or a standard zoom, which is pretty much good for everything. So there. Okay, I like traveling. What camera do I choose? Now, here's the tricky part. People have different ways of traveling. Like for me, for example, I wouldn't mind carrying all these because I want to come up with specific photos, and I have lenses that I want to bring with me around. If you want to use an interchangeable lens, then maybe you can consider having a camera and a lens that's well, basically what we call a walk-around lens. This walk-around lens or all-around lens is basically a lens that goes from wide angle to telephoto, usually around 18 or 24 millimeters to 200 millimeters. These lenses, basically their biggest benefit is range. That means you're never going to have to change lenses as you're walking around wherever you are. If you want to take a wide shot of maybe a cityscape or a nice vista, and when you want to take portraits or maybe a distant scene that you'd want to take a photo of. So you can just zoom in all the way and take that photo without having to change lenses. And as an example, my wife, for example, she wanted to take portraits. So I got her a fixed focal range lens, a 50 millimeter with an aperture of f1.8. Now, the advantage of that is that it can give a bit more depth of field, and it can basically give you bokeh or blur the background. And this is a very favorite aspect for portrait photographers. Now, for myself, I wanted to get an ultra wide angle lens. It goes from maybe 16 millimeters to 35 for full frame cameras, or 10 millimeters to 24 or 22 for APS-C or cropped sensor cameras. And these are good for taking outdoor scenes, wide angle shots, architecture, cityscapes, and basically the things that I like shooting. So it's most important that when you do buy your next lens after your kit, is that you know exactly what you want to shoot. And from there on, there are such an awesome variety to choose from. And I'm sure that basically learning about them and choosing between them is going to be a fun process for you. Know what you want to shoot. If you're going to take photos, if you're going to take both photos and videos, or if you're going to do video alone. So now the question is, do you really need to buy a new camera now? Well, of course it depends. If you have a good smartphone, or maybe you have an old camera, or maybe there's someone you can borrow a camera from. It's good to try out if you really want or need, or if you really would continue this new hobby or even have it as your new profession. Now, to tell you a bit of a background story, when I started photography, I was in my junior year in high school. And during that time, I was mainly doing a lot of making music, but for some reason, I found myself wanting to try photography out. Now, of course, smartphones weren't as good back then. So the first camera I actually ever used was one of those soap-shaped digital cameras from way back 2007, and it was just something that my mom had. And so what I did was I just played around with it. So a tip is that the first thing you should practice is basically finding a subject and composing it. Composition means putting your subject in a strategic place in the frame to make it look good. And composition is the very foundation of photography. If you're able to practice with any simple camera and be able to do good compositions, then you do really well with better cameras. So what happened when I started outgrowing that camera? Well, I had a good friend. His name is Glenn, and during that time, he was already into photography, and he was also already venturing into doing video. So he had a bit of time to lend his camera to me whenever he would go out and shoot video. I'd take his old DSLR. It was an old Canon 350D, and if I'm not mistaken, it had like 8 megapixels or something. And basically, from borrowing that camera, I began to realize that, okay, maybe I'm gonna do it for a while. And it's been 13 years. I've had multiple experiences with different cameras, and now I know exactly what I want. So never ever rush into things. You don't need to buy right away, but maybe do a bit of research. And also, it's very important to try and feel that camera and see what it can do for you, specifically for what you want to shoot. Again, some cameras are better for high-speed stuff. Maybe if you want to shoot people running, people playing sports, then you're gonna have to get a camera that's made for that. Now, some cameras have better resolution but have slower reflexes, and that's more for slower paced shooting, like shooting landscapes, maybe a bit of travel photography, or shooting in a controlled environment like a studio. And of course, there are cameras that are best for videos, and these cameras are not necessarily big in megapixels, but they have sensors that are optimized for shooting video, especially shooting video in very dark situations. Photography is all about light, and the absence of light can be one of the biggest challenges in photography. So there. The most important thing is to feel what you want to shoot and find the right camera for it. So take your time in choosing your first or maybe your next camera, so that you don't waste any money in something that you eventually wouldn't use anyway. So there. If you have any questions or maybe some reactions or some things that you want to learn, feel free to leave comments down below and I'll get to you.